solar and wind are the best renewables, which we'll probably get to later. Then you've got the issue of low density. So if you think about, say, a coal-fired power station and the associated coal mine, you're probably talking about energy density of, multiple tens of kilowatts per square metre. Whereas with solar, over a year, you might get 30 watts per square metre. With wind, you might get 10 watts in net terms. You've got night time, like in theory, there's 1,000 watts coming in per square metre, but that's across, on the profile to the Earth's surface. There's 4 times as much surface area in the Earth as the profile, so you divide by 4. Then you've got night time, you've got cloud, you've got this, that, and the other thing. You've got dust on the things. You can only get actually a 50% efficiency or 55% even in theory. So you add all this up and you end up, you're doing pretty well if you get 30 watts out of a solar panel across the whole year.
And how many watts does it take to run an average household?
Well, the average person in a Western country, in a sort of middle-class person, would be responsible for about 15,000 watts.
So the average solar panel gives you 30 watts, and the average person takes up
so
15,000.
Yeah. Now, and of course, I didn't... so you've got this problem of low density that you basically need. I think a person would need about sort of 600 square metres or so of solar panels per person when you do the thing of the redundancy and everything. Which is a lot. And just to sort of build that many, 600 solar panels per person across the whole world is a huge exercise, just in terms of the amount of energy required to do that capital investment. Okay, so wind is less, a lower density, about 10 watts. But of course, wind towers can be shared with other things. You can put wind in a field and you can grow stuff in the field or whatever. So wind is lower density, again, than solar. And then you've got others which are just tiny. Biofuels, you might get 1 watt per square metre out of your farmland. Geothermal, the flux of energy from the Earth's core is about 1/10 of a watt per square metre. So, it drops. Now, there are hot spots, but they're finite. And once you've taken that energy out, it will take thousands of years to replenish.
Okay.
And even, hydroelectric is basically maxed out. Every hydroelectric opportunity has been taken, and the dams are silting up. About 10% of the hydroelectric capacity is lost to silting already, and the dams have to be replaced every so often. Huge concrete dams. Okay, so that's lack of density, and the lack of density also applies to my 4th point, which is batteries. Just to give you an idea, the lithium-ion battery in your laptop has an energy density of roughly 1/60th of the energy density of petrol.
What is energy density?
In other words, how many joules per kilogram?
How many joules per kilogram? So how much energy can store up in a kilo?
How much energy stored in the battery. And so this is one reason why it's going to be very difficult to do battery-powered aircraft. Because
so I should run my laptop on petrol. It's probably more efficient. I should run my laptop on petrol instead.
Well, there have been various attempts to use like fuel cells or whatever, but of course it's very difficult to take such a thing onto an aircraft.
You might not want to put it in an enclosed room either.
No, there is actually a limit to the size of a battery you're allowed to take on an aircraft as well. So there's a density issue with batteries, and of course, if you put batteries in an aircraft as opposed to petrol, if you fill an aircraft up with aircraft fuel or whatever, aviation fuel, which is basically petrol. As the fuel tanks are depleted, the plane gets lighter. But batteries don't get lighter as they get depleted. It's actually worse than it looks. When fully loaded, 60 times, but across the whole trip, it would be more like 100 times lower density for batteries than compared to an oil-based fuel. So the low density issue applies to batteries as well.
So when a plane's flying, they take into account that the plane will be lighter halfway through and that they need to use less petrol halfway through. Okay, yeah.
That's right. I mean, they do get much lighter. And it's a sort of trade-off. If you don't want to put too much fuel in the plane, because it will take more energy to fly it. On the other hand, you don't want to have too little in case you run out. So they have to do that sort of balancing act. Yeah, so that's batteries, and it really is a big problem with batteries, because batteries were invented about 130 years ago. They've got better at about 7% per annum since then. That is to say, the best batteries have got 7% better. If you look at any given battery technology, it has improved at a more rapid rate. So if you look at, say, lithium-ion batteries, from the first sort of experimental curiosities to now, they've improved at a rapid rate. But for most of that period, they were completely uncompetitive, so it's irrelevant. And the most rapid improvements were before it became competitive with, say, NiCad batteries or lead-acid batteries.
7% a year, though. That's doubling every 8 years or something.
Yeah,
like
but
that.
they started off from a very low base. Whereas with computers, it's like 50.
But if batteries are still doubling every 10 years or 8 years or whatever it is, then aren't we just going to get great batteries in the next 20, 30
Well,
years?
you take, say, if you're doubling every 10 years, and you have to go up by a factor of 60 to be competitive.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
It's a while up, and that assumes that it keeps going. There's been a lot of brilliant minds have worked on the problem, and it's not a problem that's going to go away quickly in the next 10 years or so. Okay, so, and then you've got the four impossibles. So you've got, as I mentioned, air travel is a big issue. Now, people have put together aircraft that will hold 4 people, and they don't take their suitcases with them, and then none of them are that overweight, and they can go short haul travel. So you can sort of do that kind of thing with batteries. But fully laden 747 with 600 people on board, forget it. But the batteries, if you're flying from Australia to Dubai or whatever, halfway to London, you're going to be basically all the weight is taken by batteries, and there's no room for cargo or people.
That sounds interesting, though. I would like to take a personal flight. Like, if you have some luggage with you and you have like 1 or 2 people on a flight, and then you would take your suitcase with you, and it would be like Uber but for planes, and it would all be renewable. That sounds like a pretty cool feature.
Yeah. It just doesn't scale up to. As I said, it can be done, but it's very expensive. It's more a private jet kind of type scenario than mass commercial transportation. $1,200 to fly to London kind of thing. So batteries, and then you get onto the impossibles. So you've got, I mentioned, air transport is really not a solved problem with the current technology for renewables. You've got shipping, heavy transport. There's some possibility of some routes could be run with electric trains, but in general, heavy transport is all over the place. And then you've got concrete manufacture. You basically heat limestone and it expels this carbon dioxide, but it emits carbon dioxide that way. And then steel manufacture. There are some ideas of how to manufacture steel without producing vast amounts of carbon dioxide. You basically, to make steel, you sort of mix iron oxide with coking coal and heat it up, and the oxygen is expelled, and you end up with steel. So that produces a lot of carbon dioxide, and there are theories of how you could possibly do it. So those things are very difficult to do with batteries. You might think ships could run on batteries because they're just floating, but in fact, the heavier the ship, the lower it sits in the sea, and the more drag you get.
Yeah, they take hundreds of tons of cargo, thousands. Of course, they would drag down.
That's right, but if you have heavy batteries, you basically need more energy, so you get into a sort of self-defeating cycle.
It sounds like one of the biggest problems here is that batteries aren't good enough with renewables. That's what's really stopping us.
If you could come up with a battery, that's exactly right. If you could come up with a battery that's 20 times better than the lithium-ion battery, and that didn't use scarce materials and take a lot of energy to produce, a lot of the problem would be solved, but although not completely. I think I did a sort of simulation based on that, and you still have capacity issues just in terms of the ability to soak enough energy out of the sunlight. Just in terms, if you made the assumption that, say, the living standards would continue to go up by 2% a year, the Earth's population continues to grow to 12 billion, and the poorer countries got to middle class levels, if all those things happened, it's still quite difficult, even with good batteries. But
Mm.
batteries are definitely the biggest bottleneck at the moment. So this is where the poor batteries. Um, this is where I think the turning the carbon dioxide into oil or something like oil
Mm.
has a role to play. And it's not batteries are useful in a number of ways. One thing, if you say we talked about England before, you think about England. Well, you could say, look, what we do is we'll put solar panels in, say, Libya, in the desert, and then we'll just have cables going up to England, and we can solve the problem there. But then you've got the problem that we've got some guy in Libya with his hand on the power plug, on the plug, saying, well, you do what we want, or I will cut off the power instantly.
Yeah.
And the sort of geopolitical vulnerabilities involved in that. You've already had issues with Russia cutting off oil, gas pipelines and so on,
Mm.
threatening to do that. So you've got that vulnerability, and creating those huge cable networks is very expensive as well. Shipping oil from one place to another is very cheap.
Mm.
So if you make oil from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you can then ship energy around at will. We could make oil in the desert in Australia and then ship it to the rest of the world. So we could be a leading oil producer.